We didn't deliberately do this thing of the women in the middle and the men at the sides. But for those of you who speak Hindi, there is a saying that came back to me from my childhood. And since this is a panel about translation, that says, sorry, Ranjit, Srinath, it's not personal. It's Aas-paas Bandar, Beech mein Ramchandar. But I'm not sure we want to be Ramchandar. So thank you all for being here. This is the last panel of the day. It's called Indian Accent, Taking Indian Literature to the World Stage. And we have a really eminent panel who've been introduced to you. We're going to interpret the tagline of the panel in our own way. Although translation doesn't get mentioned in the tagline, this is going to be a panel about translation. All the writers here are translators as well. And we're going to read translation or interpret translation in a somewhat broad and multi-layered way, not looking only at the question of source language to target language, which I think has been talked about enough, but not looking at language, because language is about translation, and we are, as Sarah just pointed out to me, translating all the time in all our actions, even as we are reading road signs and thinking of them and calling up the histories that they tell us. So we're going to look at translation rather widely. We are going to look at it as a journey that people make when they decide to time travel, perhaps look at literatures and stories written centuries ago and try and present them and interpret them in the present day, and therefore look at how meaning might carry across those times and what is the language in which you actually bring that meaning to readers. We're going to look at it as journeys of connectedness, so seeking connections both with your own histories, your own languages, your journeys which might have alienated you from the environment to which you belong, the culture which is your home culture, the village which is your home village, and journeys through which you seek that, journeys in which you move away from that, journeys in which you see different kinds of connections. So we're going to look at it in that sense as well, and a whole host of others which I shan't lay out for you because I'm hoping that our speakers will be able to do that. We are also going to look at the world stage, not as it is traditionally understood, so therefore not as, for example, the difference is made between what is international, and international always seems to be something that is located in the West, and what is something other than international, which is what all of us are living. So we're going to look at the world as where we are. This is the world for us. This is our world. And we're going to look at the world in terms of the location of the writer, the location of the translator, the language into which the translator carries the work. We're not ruling out the so-called international world, which is usually a stand-in for the Western world, and which is even more of a stand-in mostly for English and the English-speaking world. So while recognizing all those hierarchies, we want to say there are many worlds, and the world is also here with us, and that's really what we're going to focus on. And finally, we are going to look at translation historically, because the act of translation and the ways in which translations of literature are carried into the world also changes over time. And if we are looking at India, we have seen a great deal of change within India, where let's say in the last half century or a little more than that, translation largely meant translating from Indian languages into English. And it was called translating from regional languages into English, which I hate because regional language somehow diminishes a language which is much, much bigger than, say, something like English, although English has a pan-Indian status in the way that some other Indian languages may not. So translating from Indian languages into English, and I deliberately say the last 30, 40 years, because previous to that, I think historically there was a lot of movement between languages, which somehow kind of dropped off as we adopted English much and more as a language of communication and power. But I think that's changing now, and we are seeing a lot of translations, not only from English into Indian languages, but between Indian languages. And so historically, things have changed, and what does that mean for the act of translation? These are some of the basics on which we are going to base our discussion today. And we're going to have it like a conversation, no long speeches by any of the panelists. If they start to make long speeches, I'll cut them off. So I'm going to start with putting a question to all of you. So you've all been introduced. We don't need to do that. Putting a question to all of you about really what does translation mean to you? What does the act of translation mean to you? Why do you translate? And Kirti, may I start with you?
Am I audible? Yeah, okay. I came to translation formally very, very late in life. But all along, because I come from a bilingual family and a multilingual city, I've been translating in my head all the time between languages. If something happened in that English medium school that I went to, and I came home, my mother would say, "What happened?" And I'd tell her in Marathi. My grandmother would say, "Ye naitama," and I would tell her what happened. Then my nanny, she'd say, "Bibi, kya ho gaya school mein? Humko bhi to bolo na." And here I was telling them an experience which I had in school in 3 different languages. So I've been translating all my life. Formally, I started only in 1994, only because my friends who were working with me, my colleagues, couldn't find the equivalent of the word mad used in a Marathi story by Prakash Sant. Now, mad is used like awesome or, wonderful or any one of these cool or dude, like an expression like that. And they had no clue what it was all about. But because I had young cousins who spoke Marathi and used the word mad as an adjective to describe anything, I could explain it to them. And then when they knew that I knew Marathi and Kannada, when they found out, they asked me to translate, and that's how I started.
But you translate from all the 3 languages?
Yes, I have done translations from all 3 languages. Strangely, the first story I translated was by Jayant Kaikini called Amritaballi Kashaya, which later was translated by Tejaswini Niranjana. And it was published by Katha. And I translated a story from Hindi by Dr. Shirish Dhoble called Making Amends. So I didn't come to Marathi till much later. It was only maybe a year and a half later that I started translating from Marathi, a language, by the way, which I have never studied. I studied Kannada. It was compulsory in school. I studied Hindi because it was a language which we had to pass right up to BA. But Marathi I've never studied. I've just picked up as I went along.
So it was actually so interesting to hear that it was looking for a translation for the word mad.
That's right.
That actually drove you into this mad world of translation.
So it is really mad that I've started translating from Marathi when I hadn't read a single story or a word of Marathi till then.
Okay, we'll come back to some of the points that are inbuilt in what you're saying. Sarah, let me turn to you.
Yeah, okay. I'm really bad with mics. This somehow die on me. I hope you can hear me. Well, translation, Urvashi asked me, what does it mean to me? Translation, I think in a very fundamental sense, we translate all the time, because when we look at the world, we are not looking at it in languages. We are looking at it in pictures. So even at that very basic level, we are translating from the world of pictures to the world of words. Starting from there, I mean, language in a sense names the world for us, it names us, it gives us our identity. So at that very basic level, we all of us are translators. So starting with that. But then with translation, when I came to translation, To start with, I studied in an English medium school. I came from a family in which everyone speaks Hindustani. My mother speaks Urdu. My father also speaks a Hindustani kind of laced Hindi. And in the region where I come from, which is Uttar Pradesh, there's other languages also being spoken. There's Awadhi, there's Bhojpuri, which my grandmother, my father's mother used to speak. So all these languages, and in school, there were these German nuns who would speak to us in very correct, very German sort of English, because where the particular stress in a word should fall, it should be industry, not industry, or emergency, not emergency, stuff like that. So you are speaking very correct English in school. And at home, I'm speaking Hindustani, and I'm speaking Urdu, and I'm listening to Awadhi, and I'm listening to Bhojpuri. So all these languages are entering my consciousness in a kind of, there's a sleeping pool of languages, I call it. There's a sleeping pool of languages inside all of us, not just me. It's all of us. It's our destiny as South Asians. We know many languages. We live in many languages. So when I started translating, my translation was a kind of act of groping for a language that could be my own, because I didn't know which language I could write in. Because I was quite fluent in English, I was fluent in Hindi, I didn't know which one I should write in. So for a long time, I didn't write at all. I started translating. I translated from Hindi to English, from English to Hindi, from Urdu to English. So this whole journey was going on of translating. So it was also trying to understand myself, what do I actually want to do. So it started like that, and then, it was a sort of exercise, like in singing, you do the scales, or in piano, you practice the scales. So it was something like that. I was trying to figure out languages. So it started like that. But then after that, I translated, and I've translated from Hindi and Urdu, and also back to Hindi. So, and then after that, of course, I discovered my identity as a writer. So I started writing my fiction in Hindi, which is also, an Urdu-laced Hindi. It's not the very correct Sanskrit kind of Hindi, but it's that sort of thing. So I write my stories in that, but recently I wrote my memoir in English. So I was a bit puzzled why I did that. Why did I write my memoir in English when all of my writing so far has been in Hindi? And then it came to me that the lens that I use when I'm looking at the world around me, which comes out in my fiction, is the lens of Hindi. But the sensibility that I bring to what I see is English, because all my reading has been in English. And when you're trying to frame a piece of writing, which is not fiction, which is non-fiction, somehow English, the economy of English, suits it better. So I can only say that, which is why I wrote my memoir in English. So that's the only thing I've written in English, actually. So that's my relationship with languages and with translation.
Can I ask you just a supplementary question to that, Sarah? So you wrote your memoir in English because you say the sensibility you bring to looking back at that life is in English. But what did that do for the indecision of which language to write in? Is it now clear in your head that a certain kind of writing will take place in English?
No, it's not clear at all. Sometimes I wake up and I find myself writing in English. Sometimes I sort of start writing. I write in Hindi all the time. Sometimes I dream I'm writing in English. And in fact, when I was a child, my training was in English, because I went to an English medium school where speaking in Hindi was forbidden. You were fined if you spoke in Hindi. So English was this language. So when my Hindi stories started coming out, someone actually asked me, how did you write them? Did you write them in Roman? How do you know Hindi? So it was like something like that, So it was a very peculiar relationship. But I think when one writes in a particular language, and if the other languages that I said are sort of inside you, in that sleeping pool of languages inside you, they exercise a kind of weight on the language that you're writing in. So if I'm writing in Hindi, the English sensibility also bears upon it, So it's not, the multilingualism of our country is such that when you're writing in one language, the other languages are also at the same time exerting pressure on it. So it's something like that, It's a kind of multilingual thing. So,
okay, yeah. That's very nice. Okay, Srinath, turning to you with the question of what does translation mean to you? Why do you translate? When did you start to translate?
Hello. Yeah. Thanks, Urvashi. I started translating, 7 or 8 years back, I think. Ghachar Gochar was my first translation from Kannada. And by then I was already writing in English. And I was also traveling around the country and so on. And there was this sort of creeping feeling of inauthenticity that had grown within me. And part of it had to do with language. The language I speak at home with my family is a North Karnataka dialect of Kannada. Outside in Bangalore, on the streets, playing with friends, I would speak the Mysore Kannada. And at school, we were not particularly encouraged to. I went to a sort of Hindu convent school where, the Christian convent schools are doing well. So this was started by a Hindu seer, and we wore saffron pants and yellow shirts and so on. And we were encouraged to speak in English. And for a brief while, there was even a fine for speaking any language in school other than. So my school was not like Sarah's school. And there was a lot of encouragement given for people to speak English. And probably that's why I ended up writing in English. But it gave me a sense of being disconnected from the ground in some way because I like literature. I like literature as a means of understanding the world around me, as I think many of us do. And in that sense, I felt like I was floating a little bit above the ground. So I was looking to get involved with a project that involved Kannada to some extent. And translation seemed like a really good way to get closer to the language. And Vivek Shanbag was a friend of mine. He asked me if I'd want to, read Ghachar Gochar in Kannada and see if I can translate it. And I went for it. And I suppose after that, I didn't intend to do more than one, but I suppose it became successful, so now I'm stuck doing translations after that to some extent. So that's why I may do it now. That original reason no longer holds. I feel quite authentic now somehow. I don't know why. Nothing much has changed, but still that feeling has gone away. And when I was listening to all of you, I just remember a few years ago, there was this gathering in Delhi where a magazine editor asked me, tell me something, you translate, don't you feel a little bit like a parasite when you do that? So, and translators are very good at analogies. So when translators are asked to explain what they do, they find many, it's like conducting music someone has written. It's like, I don't know, knitting a sweater. Right? It's like many. It's like copying a painting. It's like many things. But this is the first time I'd heard this parasite analogy used for translation. And no, I don't feel like a parasite at all, because I told her that, I thought for a while, and I told her that translation is a form in itself, that it is not to be understood totally as a derivative sort of a thing. It is an art in itself. You can argue what the contours of that art are. It is not identical to composing an original literary work, but it is a different form in itself. So I think that is what it's come to mean to me now.
So do you think that remark about it feeling parasitical comes from a sense that translation is feeding on somebody else's work?
I think that was what she meant, yes, yeah.
It was what you meant. Can I ask you just another small question? You said Vivek Shanbag asked you to, why don't you think of reading Ghachar Gochar in Kannada, and then you began to translate. But did you read a lot in Kannada earlier?
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
Even now, my reading speed in Kannada is like woefully inadequate. In fact, translation also becomes attractive to me because I read so slowly. I might as well bang it out on the side in English, and rather than just finishing a book, I would have translated a book. I mean, not quite. My reading speed is getting better, but no. I did study Kannada in school, but it was not my first language. The subject, in fact, was called compulsory Kannada, so you can imagine how much love for the language that might have instilled.
No, I'm just wondering whether the sense of alienation that you refer to has to do with the absence of language, of the language in which you have been born and grown up, if one can use that word?
Yeah, no, it certainly did, but I knew the language, but in a street way. But what I didn't have access to was, higher levels of meaning that you get through language. Experiencing a place and people through literature, through poetry, and so on, and which I think was important to me at some level. And I was doing it in English to an extent, but that cut me off from my immediate environs. And that, I think, was what was troubling me.
Okay. Kirti, you're looking like you want to say something. May I turn to Ranjit first, and and then you could come in, or do you want to step in?
No, please carry on.
Okay. So Ranjit, what does it mean to you, and how did you come to it? And I know that from reading your translation of Lala that there is a very interesting search there, very interesting journey there. So if you could talk a bit about that.
You know, I think it's, in many ways, from what everyone has said, this is very true of the South Asian condition. I also grew up in a very multilingual family, and also happen to belong to this ethnic group that has a diasporic history. So there's a history of a lost language in the background. And for all kinds of reasons, various uncles, aunts, cousins spoke various languages. So at no point was I committed, even as a child, to a singular language. I also spent formative years of my childhood in a fairly recently liberated or annexed Goa. So it was very Indo-Iberian. There was Portuguese in the air, was spoken. My father was a Germanophile, so he started me off on German quite early. So at no point did I sense that language was to be a field of antagonism. It was always approached with curiosity, with a certain degree of discovering a new world. So I think for me that has always been a key driver. I see languages as gateways into other universes. And that's the spirit in which, I think that's informed my, if you will, my will to translate. But particular translations have emerged for different reasons. As you said, my translation of Lal Ded came out of this desire to connect with a lost ancestral history and a language in the first place. But in the time it took me to work on this, I also realized that this could not be done in a philological or an artifactual kind of way, because I was also, as a translator, responsible to that language and its current speakers and the situation in the place where it's spoken. So, and the 20 years that I worked on this were also probably 20 of the worst years in Kashmir's history. So that translation and all translation for me also is a political act. So it was not only the Vaks of Lalla that I was translating, but I was also carrying out a process of understanding the scenario. What are the complex and demanding histories from which this work emerges and to which it remains relevant? So these dimensions of translation are also very, very crucial to me. I'm working on Mir Taki Mir now from the Urdu. There again, I find it vital that this translation is not just a philological kind of activity, it's also about a vanished world, a language with a very complex history that is today sought to be put in a box, marginalized for all kinds of political reasons. So, I mean, these are two examples that I would offer. So for me, it's a political act. It also is, since I'm a practicing poet, translation expands I have a selfish reason too. It expands my poetic repertoire, not only in terms of these sensibilities of the people I'm translating that come into mind, but also because it creates a syntactic challenge to the English that I write in. And to me, that's been one of the most interesting aspects of translation as a poet in the last few years. I mean, what do I learn from the diaphaneity of Urdu syntax, the elusiveness, or the elusiveness of it, or Lala's Vaks? I mean, there's a kind of robust simplicity which I think liberated me from certain Baroque ways of writing of my own at an earlier point.
So you, one of the things that you do, and I think all of you have kind of in some sense alluded to this thing, but Ranjit, you specifically talk about, and you just said it, access to a vanished world. Okay? When that vanished world, and many translators do this, they will translate classical works, etc. When you are trying to access those works have been, over the years, have acquired additions, accretions, changes, layers, so that there is no longer this Ur text that is there somewhere. And therefore, the whole obsession in translation with the faithfulness to an original text, if you could speak to that, any of you, and In that sense, Rina, the collaborative translations that you do, where in the act of translating, the original text itself might transform if you're doing it in collaboration with the author, because you've done both, in collaboration, and you've done Girish Karnad's autobiography when Girish was not around. So if you could just talk to that a little bit, that how important is this text, original text, business in the act of translation? And Kirti, I want you to ask you to speak to that in terms of the, this whole notion of authenticity that attaches to translation. When you're translating in different languages, and each of you has said, none of you is expert in the language you translate from or the language you translate to. And that might seem like a really heretical thing to do in this act, which has been so held up that you have to be perfect in X language and perfect in Y language to be able to convey meaning from one to the other. So what about this notion of authenticity, original text, faithfulness, etc.? Who's going to?
I can take on the old text question.
Sorry?
I can take on the old text question.
Okay.
Well, actually, yeah, I mean, I think when you're translating something, the translation has to stand on its own feet. You can't use the original text as a sort of crutch on which you base your translation. And to translate, you first have to own the text. You have to internalize what you're writing. So it's not a word-to-word translation. It's you're translating the spirit of the times, of the text, of the thing that you have in your hand in front of you. So in that way, translation also becomes an act of original writing, I think, because, I mean, what happens, say, to a poet like Kabir, who over the 100 centuries, he has been owned by the populace. Everyone has their own Kabir. You'll just find even in a village, some woman who's baking a clay pot or something, she'll be quoting Kabir. And that is not, who was Kabir? We don't know who Kabir was and which is the original Kabir, because everyone has their own Kabir, so it's something like that. The translation also becomes an original work of writing because the translator internalizes that work first. And so in a sense, I mean, the original text doesn't really matter. I mean, I think when you're translating, you have to translate the spirit, and of course, there are certain ethical boundaries that you can't cross. You can't sort of make the text completely different. But there's something about, you have to internalize a text and then reproduce it in your way, without translating word to word. That's...
So, sorry, Ranjit, I know I have a question. If the author is alive, what happens to the clash of egos, yours and the author's?
That's a different thing altogether. It's got nothing to do with translation. It's an ego battle. So I don't know what happens. Obviously, I mean, one would consult the author also. If such an author is alive, then you would not just go about taking liberties with their work. You would obviously consult them and see if they approved of it or not. So that, I suppose, would have to be done.
Ranjit, you wanted to speak to the old text.
Yes. Specifically in the context of, say, Lalla or Kabir, it's because this corpus has come down to us across the centuries, it's really not the work of a single author. It's a collective effort across generation, gender, religious location, all of this. So when dealing with such a text, certainly this was my approach, I saw myself as bearing witness to these precise complexities. So I don't think it's possible to think about an ur-text and decry things that came later as interpolations. So that model doesn't work for me at all. I find it much more important to celebrate the fact that this is a living text that has had contributors add to it. And, as a commentator, this is what I would point out and celebrate, not to say that this is fraudulent or fake, but precisely to say that there's some incredible impulse in this corpus that has allowed people to make it their own, as Sarah was saying just now. So that's my view of the ur-text. But it opens up a whole commentatorial set of possibilities. And I think it's that unglamorous, artisanal part of the translator's task that appeals very much to me. Making a concordance, setting up a glossary if necessary, the annotations. There's all of that work, which is as much a part of our work as translators as the text itself.
Text, yeah. Kirti, you all had something to say earlier also. Wait, should I give you this mic or you use that?
No, I was smiling because I realized that all of us, except Sarah probably, who has a solid Hindi Urdu base, in addition to having that equally efficient command over the English language, all of us felt that we have no real connection with our mother tongues or father tongues or whatever, and since I have two, because you said that you felt a sense of disconnect or that you were floating. Strangely, I never got that feeling. I never felt I was deprived of Marathi or Kannada or any other language, simply because for me, language was one way of relating to people and one way of communicating. Because I think that is ultimately the function of language, to communicate. And if you can communicate an experience in whatever language, it doesn't matter whether it's yours. I mean, this whole business of language chauvinism that I'm seeing around, especially in some languages, I think it's so unnecessary. No, as long as you can say, get somebody to respond to what you're saying in the same way that you responded to a situation, I think your task is accomplished. And therefore, I never felt disconnected from Kannada. I went back to Marathi reading only because I thought it was interesting, that it was adding something to me. And my firm belief is, no matter how old you are, no matter how much you have read, there's always something to learn. And Marathi was something which I had never read. I had heard. For me, Marathi came as an oral tradition. Kannada came as a textbook knowledge, like you said. You know, you didn't have any access to Kannada literature when you were in school. The same thing with me. And from my time till now, I think children are reading the same poems in Kannada in class 7 that I studied so many 100 years ago. So nothing has changed. And I wanted that to change. Now, I've had the advantage of living in different cities. We were in Calcutta, we were in Delhi for 18 years, we were in Chennai for 7, 8 years, and you had to pick up the local language. Unless you did that, you were alienated from the people. And if you spoke to a Bengali in broken Bangla, and I would say, "Ami bolte pari na, ami bujhte pa." Completely wrong, perhaps. But immediately, the vendors would think that she is one of us. The same thing would happen in Marathi in Maharashtra or in Bangalore. But another very interesting point I want to make here, when I was talking about Kannada, and Srinath, you said North Karnataka Kannada, I said, "Ye naitama," when I quoted what my grandmother would ask me. My grandmother would never have said that. This is the Mysore Kannada influence of my married family, my husband's language. She would have said, "Ye natova." You know, the accent is different, the words are different, you know. So this is how what language means to me. Different people, speaking different languages. But they all mean something, and they are important.
Thank you for actually drawing our attention to two very key points, to which I want to come back in this next round after Srinath has spoken. One of them is really the ways in which translation and languages are connected to migration patterns, how people move from rural to urban or different places, India to abroad, etc., and the connections with languages that draw them back or connect them to things. And the second point that you made when you spoke of language chauvinism, in some ways about the hierarchies of language. Because I think language chauvinism, to a large extent, I think we need to also understand it in terms of the hegemony of more powerful language being imposed on people who fear the danger of losing their language and therefore the assertion of that language. So when you had the whole language movement in Tamil Nadu, the assertion of Tamil as a language, that was because of the imposition or the attempt from the center to impose Hindi, which gives rise to different kinds of language movements as well. But we'll come back to that point because we want to talk about the hierarchies that are implicit in this world. So Srinath, after you.
Yeah, no, that's a very pertinent point that you just made, because I think it's been playing out in Karnataka as well with Kannada over the last few years. And I can see why that is happening. There are certain examinations which you cannot write in Kannada, for government jobs and so on. There are bank managers who speak only Hindi. And when you're in a rural place in Karnataka and so to be unable to access your own money because someone insists on speaking to you in Hindi is quite insulting. And I can totally get why many people are frustrated about it. And perhaps you can say that, they lash out in ways that are stronger than required, but I completely understand where this response is coming from. But you asked me a long time ago about original texts and collaborative processes and so on. And I really like this quotation, this sort of provocation by Borges about translation, where he says, the original is not faithful to the translation, which I guess it can be thought of in many ways. But one of the ways is that translation is a sort of living process, and then what you come out, as Sarah was saying, is, I think it is something that is a kind of conjoined product of multiple consciousnesses, perhaps. And in the case of, Kabir and so on, in the case of people like Kabir, I guess there's a long series of, people who have related to it in certain ways, and it's almost like biological evolution in a way, but it's happening with the text. And one of my favorite translators is Anthea Bell, who's of course, renowned translator from French and German. But I like her most for her Asterix comics, which I think sort of wonderfully and almost in a cartoon way, literally, illustrate some of the challenges that translators face. So she had to, it took me a long time to even realize that the Asterix comics were originally in French and that I was reading them in English. And a lot of the, my most favorite puns and so on were generated not by the original writer, but by Anthea Bell, who's a chief translator of the text. So she had a cartoon panel, she had a speech bubble, and whatever was in French, and she knew what the scene was doing. And she had to find equivalents in English to, and she was trying to create a joke when it wasn't, completely, when there was cultural context in the original that couldn't map onto English. What she would have to do is know that the function of the original here was to create a joke with a certain mood and register and so on. And she would simply have to recreate something like that in English. So many of the things that we find, things like dogmatics and cacophonics, and all these were made up by the translator rather than the original author. And I contrast this on one end with what I've seen happen most frequently with academic translations of fiction and poetry and so on, where I think a kind of background interest is always anthropology, that you want to describe a book in great detail so that this becomes the text on which scholarship can be based. For example, I can think of Gayatri Spivak's translations of Mahashweta Devi,
stories,
where I think words that were said in English in the original were italicized in English translation, so that you can tell what was what. And of course, to a normal English reader who just comes to it as anything else, it just changes the weight of everything, right? I mean, unless you're a scholar who really wants to know who did what and so on. This completely changes everything. And I think this mode of translation is more prevalent in academics, which, you have footnotes and so on. But coming to collaborative work, it is, I think I prefer the Anthea Bell side of doing things. And so, which is why when I translate a novel, I do it with the consciousness of a writer to some extent. In the sense, it's hard for me to go on if something isn't feeling right. And very often this is because conventions differ in different languages. In English, for example, we don't repeat words often. Editors are very scrupulous about making sure that a word is never repeated. And in many of our Indian languages, this is simply not the case. So there are lots of conventions like that. And sometimes, there are things that just don't work for you because you are you have your own sensibility and the author has a different sensibility. And these are things that I'm very glad to be translating Vivek when it comes to these kinds of books, because he's open to talking these things over. And sometimes if he feels that the work is better served by making a small change in the Kannada text. And there's no such thing as a small change when you're looking at something as delicate as a novella or a novel, because a tiny change in one part means that you may have to revisit some other part and so on. So we usually go through a few cycles of those. And I think Vivek likes to say that the English translations are based on the second editions of his
Oh, yeah.
books. And the second edition comes about partly as a result of the translation process.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's do a little pivot. It's 7:30, and I think in about 20, 25 minutes, we'll just open it up for questions. But can we talk a little bit about taking Indian literature to the international or the world stage, and not only Indian literature really, but how translations get caught in questions of identity in the way that, let's say, writing in so-called more universal languages, so-called more international languages doesn't. Srinath, you made the point when we were having a conversation before this panel about how in recent years in India, we see much more happening in the world of translation, in the sense that there was a time when English writing in India was seen as hierarchically somewhere above the level of translation. Translation was seen as something a little bit inferior. But now that gap seems to be closing, and translations stand on their own in the world of Indian literature, as is evident here also from the bookstore, and where you will see translations jostling with original writing in English. Why do you think that is? What has happened to change that? Kirti, do you notice this phenomenon as well?
I think some of it is due to the fact that studies in comparative literature and in sociological, anthropological, political topics are becoming more commonly approached by writers, and they have a more or less universal appeal. Plus, there are efforts being made by very many people, and even among the publishing world, because I know personally from this series that Routledge has brought out on Writer in Context, 14 writers have been selected from the major languages, and they are presented. 30% of the book is the writer's own work, and 70% is critical writings on the author, so that it becomes a book where you understand the author, the context in which he or she is writing, and it becomes a text for those interested in intercultural study, interdisciplinary studies. And they've brought out 4 volumes now. Mahashweta Devi, Indira Goswami, Amrita Preetham, Krishna Sopti, Joginder Paul, and we have, Sachin Ketkar and I, have a Marathi writer called Venkatesh Madgulkar. Very few people know of him, but he was universal. He was one of the first who introduced Grameen fiction, that is rural literature. He wrote about the marginalized in a language which was accepted, understood, and he brought them to the forefront. Now, a lot of people in Marathi have read Madgulkar, but he's not been translated. So that was my reason for choosing Madgulkar. So these are the kind of efforts. Now, various publishers are bringing out anthologies or collections of the best Marathi short stories, or Malayalam short stories, or Tamil stories. So this is another reason why translations are gaining popularity or visibility more than popularity, and support. Like the Tamil Nadu government has a very big program to promote Tamil literature. And because of that, so many writers, and here we've got somebody sitting right here who's been translating some of the eminent writers who most people would not have known but for these programs. Yes, Prasad? He can. So, this is one reason why I think it's Indian writing is coming to the forefront in academic circles, and because there is so much of explanatory material in the text, even the lay reader would find it interesting.
I think, yes, in some ways, I think it's also to do with the opening up of academia to our own writing as opposed to basically inheriting the colonial writers as part of syllabi. That has also begun to change a little bit. But I'm glad you mentioned publishers. We had a publisher on the panel who was unable to come at the last minute, Kannan Sundaram from Kalachuvudu Publications in Tamil Nadu, who does a lot of translations. So it's a shame he's not here, but let's hear from both of you.
Yeah, I think that's a very fine point about academia also kind of contributing to this interest in literature written in Indian languages rather than just in English. I think also academia itself has changed a bit. I mean, like history, many people like to write history in the sense of a story. I mean, it's not, the whole thing is both ways. I mean, it's not that academia is promoting fiction, but fiction is also sort of changing academics. So it's a two-way process, I think. And also perhaps, I mean, one could also bring in global literature here, I think, what is called global, which is like a very, I think, it's a kind of bland style, which can be easily translated, which can be easily assimilated by sort of audiences in the West. And maybe it's a kind of reaction against that we want to bring in the local, we want to bring in flavors in the languages that we use over here. So that too could possibly be, and I think the scope of writing, as far as writing in English in India is concerned, fiction, I'm talking about fiction, I think the scope is a little limited because English being much more of a middle-class language, it does not have access to other areas. And similarly, it cannot be read by a large section of the population. So I think that is why also maybe sort of the literature that is being translated is richer, I think, richer and dealing with many more things that are immediate, they have the pulse of people living in this country. So I think people have caught on to that now, and so there's a great demand for translations from the Indian languages. So is that, I mean, I don't know, this is just a surmise.
Sorry, can I make a quick point? Sarah, you know what I honestly believe? That most of our children, I grew up speaking so many languages. My son doesn't speak a single language because he's lived all over the country and outside. And there are so many people like that. They want their children to read the books and authors that they grew up with. It's a sense of nostalgia. And therefore, there is a demand, I think, also for translated texts. A lot of it, and I know this for Marathi particularly, because there's this huge Marathi association in the US. And they have over 100,000 people coming into their sammelans where their children don't attend, but because they buy all these books, especially when the children are young, between the ages of 10 and maybe 18, they are given these books, and there is a market for it. This I know for a fact, personal experience.
If I can just add to the point that you were making, it's also that there is a lot of material available in Indian languages that is simply not there in English. Because English is mostly written by people who've grown up in cities. I guess they are the people with the amount of leisure it takes to write a book, the kind of English that would finally be published and so on. So we do have a lot of good, I think, urban material in English, but when it comes to the underclass and rural India, I think there's a lot of powerful writing in Indian languages which has simply not been available at that level of detail and granularity and so on in English. And we're slowly coming to realize that, I think, and which is why we are increasingly trying to bring more of those works into English. What do you think, Urvashi? You've been part of this.
I actually, while I see this phenomenon of more publishers showing more interest in translations, and I think it's very interesting that the new generation, among which I count, like I'm much older than you, Srinath. My generation of people thought of translation in very limited ways. Your generation, I think, thinks of it much more expansively and much more inclusively in many ways. But at the same time, I think that we as publishers are still not open to the experimentations in language and writing that are going on in our country, especially in writing that comes from people on the margins or people who have been historically marginalized. You know, the way of thinking about, say, a form of fiction may not be something which is canonical in terms of a plot, a subplot, character, etc., etc., but may simply be a collection of vignettes of, let's say, rural life, or a collection of stories of migration which are not necessarily structured around a moment of conflict, a resolution, all of those things which are traditionally seen. And these writings, I think, are subverting the canons a lot. And I don't think publishers are as yet very open to these because they don't know what to make of them. And I think it's the same issue when writings, the ways in which writings from here travel internationally, let's say travel to other markets, there are certain things which don't function very well or which don't have a lot of acceptability. For example, I remember one of the novels, a really stunning novel from Tamil that we were trying to sell to publishers in France and England, and they came back and said, actually, it doesn't work for us because it has too many characters. Now, for God's sake, all our lives have too many characters in them, you know. So how can you cut down on the number of characters and create a small family for it to be palatable? So I think the scenario is much more complicated. And I think also one thing, although I shouldn't be speaking, but one thing to add is that for literatures to travel abroad, the state or government, I guess, has to be enlightened enough to be able to promote that literature abroad through the provision of grants for translation, which pretty much every country does. India has never done it because I think we're just so scared of what will spill over. You know, you'll get the radical writers, you will get the young writers writing about sex, and you will have to pay a French publisher to translate that. I mean, what impression of India is it going to carry? So that stops the travel, which I think is a terrible thing, really. But that's our story. Ranjit, you haven't spoken.
I'm actually, I have to say I'm troubled because many of our discussions on translation seem to have this default position that it's going to be from so-called regional languages, a term I detest, to English. And I'm far more interested in, I want to know what happens in terms of inter-bhasha translations, if you will. In the first place, most of these languages are global languages through the diaspora, Gujarati, Tamil, Hindi, Urdu across borders, Bangla, and so on and so forth. So I would like to know what happens in that realm because I have grave reservations about this whole business of the linguistic states. I think that policy of foolishly dividing India into linguistic states actually has promoted chauvinism, antagonism, which did not exist to that degree because our provinces, and historically for hundreds of years, South Asia has been very, very multilingual. I mean, there's no word for mother tongue in any Indian language before the middle of the 19th century. Matrabhasha and Madhuri Zaban are calques. They are calques for Muttersprache and mother tongue. They're visited upon us by German philology. And the reason for that is, obviously, as we all know, that people express themselves in multiple languages and sometimes in formal languages that were not the home languages. So what is happening in that realm and what is being done to promote that kind of interstate, if you will, understanding is something that I'd certainly like to know more about. On the one hand, also translation outside the country. I don't think we focus enough on how our literatures go into German or Spanish, which is a huge world, or French even. So, you know, I'd be very happy to know about efforts being made in those directions as well.
Okay, so I think we've just been shown a thing that says 5 minutes only. I thought we had lots more time, but is it 5 minutes to including questions? Or, because I have one last question in which, if you can give me quick answers. The panel before ours was a panel on AI. Now, is that going to destroy Google Translate, AI? What's going to it do? Quickly, if you can say this, and then if you have any questions.
I don't think we know what's going to happen in the medium to long term, because I think we are poised at a really interesting moment. But at the moment, no, because you need some understanding of human experience to be an effective translator, which is, in this sense, in this case, I think the same as being an effective writer. So.
Nothing?
I'm terribly wary of it, and I don't want to go anywhere near that because I'm too old now to learn new tricks.
Yes, I think I agree with that. But I mean, possibly it'll generate a new kind of writing which needn't be mixed up with this. I mean, it can be somewhere separate by itself, and which can lead if you want to, and you have the option of not reading it or whatever. But I mean, it'll certainly not be anything like the translation and the writing that we do. It'll be something completely different, something else altogether.
I mean, anyone who's used Google Translate knows of its great capacity for comedy. So, I mean, machine translation, machines by definition depend on iterative protocols, algorithms, and however vast and those aggregations may be, they depend on predictability. Everything we do depends on the unpredictable, the unanticipated. So I don't think any machine is ever going to replicate that. And if it can, it's not a machine any longer, so we're not discussing artificial intelligence then.
What a nice way to conclude that.